one last note before we go on to the next strategy. Did you know this? Literally smiling can release the feel-good chemicals in your brain. They actually did a study out of Italy a number of years ago. I don't have a slide for it. I took it out. But this is what they did. They forced a smile. They took just a wooden dowel, like the size of a pencil or a pen, and they did that, and they forced people to smile, forcing a smile, and found that that also releases chemicals in your brain, right? I think a genuine smile is probably better than a fake one. Most people can tell whether you're faking the smile. But just standing and smiling at kids as they come in, it just establishes a world that's different. And when the world is different, when we have that relationship connection, then we can start to go deep. I know we're spending a lot of time on relationships, but it's that foundational. I think we have three strategies left, and we'll do the next couple pretty quickly. Actually, just two strategies. We'll do them pretty quickly, then we'll go on to the next topic. Here is the next one. First, I'll pause so you can read and just kind of comprehend what we're going to talk about. A start statement is exactly what it sounds like. We established earlier that language matters. The words we use matter quite a bit. Being a formal middle school teacher, I too easily got into the don'ts, the can'ts, and the stops in my language with kids, because middle school kids do goofy stuff that needs to be stopped. Now, there is a place for stop statements. If a child's in danger or about to be in danger, if I have a little kid who's about to run into traffic, I'm going to yell at the top of my lungs, stop. If I have a kid who's holding scissors over another kid, I'm going to yell at the top of my lungs, stop. There are times, but if we're honest, those are extremely rare times. If someone's in danger or about to be hurt, we stop things. But we're better when it comes to those minute corrections of behavior in order to get them thinking differently when we use more start statements. Because we often say things like, stop messing around, stop wasting time. A lot of the stops. Just telling a kid to stop wasting time doesn't always, it assumes they know how to start something proper, and they might not. It assumes things that might not be in their thinking. So we just refine our language. The more start statements we use, I say things like, right now the task is to begin reading on page 47. Rather than stop wasting time. Stop sharpening your pencil for the 18th time. Stop poking. Right now, we keep our hands to ourselves and read. It's just direct, and it just changes the tone. That's what you've kind of got in many of these strategies, just simply change the tone. Now, I call them start and stop statements. If you've ever heard of Becky Bailey in Conscious Discipline, she calls them replacement behaviors, and she puts them into kind of a sentence frame. So let's say you have a kid who constantly interrupts. They constantly blurt out in class. You could say, stop blurting out. Stop interrupting. You're being rude. You could say that. That might work for some kids. Becky Bailey, and along with my start statements, would say this. Pull the child aside and say, when you blurt out, it's because you typically want attention. You wanted attention. Attention is good. I want to give you my attention. It's good to want attention. It's not bad to want attention. I tell a kid that. I don't want a kid to feel bad for wanting to be heard or wanting their voice to be heard. Then I follow up and say, when you want attention, here's the process of getting it. When you want attention, when you want to be heard, when you want to sharpen your pencil, whatever it is, tell them exactly what to do instead of what not to do. We get stuck in the nots and the don'ts quite often. All right, I told you that one would be quick, so we could spend a little bit more time on the last one. We'll dig into this one just a little bit more. But here's where we've been. The last one is to make positive phone calls home. We know that parental involvement gets us a pretty good effect size at a 0.51. Anything above a 0.4 is where we want to be. But first, let me share with you one piece of evidence and one research study that was really interesting. I'm not going to kill you with research, but this research told a fascinating story. They took students who were in a high school credit recovery program. I think there were about 300 of them in a large school district who were in a credit recovery. Now, you know if a student's in a credit recovery program, life has just happened to them for whatever reason. By choice, by not, it doesn't matter. They're behind. They need to get caught up. They took those students and placed them into one of three groups. You see those groups represented by apples at the bottom. The three apples of the three groups are this. The first one in the far left, those parents received a weekly communication from the teachers regarding their progress or their status. And it was something like your child is 67% done with English 2 and their current grade is a B. It's just data. Data is good, but data alone doesn't change much. The middle group is represented by the yellow apple. Those parents received weekly data plus an improvement message. What they called an improvement message are tips, suggestions, ideas, things you can help your child with at home, how you can help. And then the control group was the red apple. They didn't receive any communication. When you look at the data for the two groups that have one thing in common, that's weekly communication, we see a pretty nice bump. Maybe not earth-shattering, but a pretty nice bump, because we were weekly in communication. This is where the story gets really, really interesting. When you look at the middle group, the parents received weekly communication that was data and help. This is what we saw. One of the messages from this data is, I don't want to stereotype too much, but if a child's in credit recovery program, it's probably partially anyway has to do with the dynamics of the home. That family is probably in a bit of disarray as well as the child. Not always, but often. If parents who are in a bit of a disarray are able to follow up and really respond this well, how much more of your quote-unquote healthy families are going to respond? It's a rhetorical question. I think the answer is big time. Our quote-unquote normal or healthy families would respond quite a bit. So let's go on. I'm going to skip over a couple things just so we can get to this one and dig into this because it's pretty good. First, I'll pause so you can decipher this slide and ask yourself, what is this slide trying to tell me? Let's tear this apart. First, I'm not suggesting that left is good or left is bad and right is good. What I'm suggesting is the left-hand column is necessary and important, but the right-hand column changes the world. As teachers, as educators, or as a school, we need to continue the robocalls and the newsletters and the website updates. We need to continue giving our families information. If families don't have information, they don't know how to respond. If families don't know when the book fair is, they can't come and spend money at the book fair. They need information. But information alone rarely changes things. Let me prove it to you. When you go home today, or at some point today, you'll check your email. You'll probably have a newsletter in there from some organization, right? Maybe it's an organization you signed up for, maybe someone else signed you up for, maybe it's even an organization you're actually really interested in, but you have newsletters there. It's information. And you're often too busy to read them, so you just hit delete without even looking at them. That's what I do. In fact, I don't even write newsletters anymore. I did for about 10 years off of my own website, send a monthly newsletter, and I stopped doing it because people don't read them. Now, if you have a connection or a bond with the person who's leading the organization, you're much more likely to open it up and read it. But just having information doesn't necessarily mean we'll act on it. But we can't not give information because then people don't know, right? What we do when we want to really change and deepen relationships and get good results is we do what's on the right, what I call higher intensity two-way strategies. We need to continue one-way communication because if we don't, people don't know. But two-way communication are those things that really change the world. Specifically, phone calls. In fact, I'm going to skip over to this one. Here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. If you don't already do this, you'll see massive results in it. Starting on week 1, make 5 positive phone calls home a week. 5 calls a week will change the world. It will change the universe. I'm absolutely convinced of it. In fact, I'll tell you a couple of brief stories to prove this point. 5 positive phone calls a week. If you're a typical elementary school teacher, that'll get through pretty much your entire class list about once a month, maybe once every 5 weeks. If you're a high school teacher, you might need to do a little bit more, but I want to get through as many of my kids pretty consistently. Maybe it's every quarter or 2 months rather than every month. I get that because at the secondary we have a lot more students. But my job here is to pick up the phone and just say positive things about the kid to the parent. In fact, it's going to sound like this. I'll model it with my phone here. So I think of a kid that I want to say something nice about, that I can say something nice about. It could be a quality, a characteristic, a deed, something they did. So I dial the number, and this is what it sounds like. Yeah, hi, hello, this is Dr. Harris. I'm your son's math teacher here at the high school. Anyway, I just wanted to call and just say, hey, how much I love having your son in class. He's got a great sense of humor, always comes with a great attitude. Anyway, that's the only reason I called, just to let you know how much I really like having your son in class. Anyway, that's it. Then I hang up real fast. Why do I hang up so fast? Because that was a message. Nobody answers their phones anymore. But if it was an actual live person, I would have said the same exact thing, and they said, and it would have ended like this. Yep, that's the only reason I called. Then there's going to be that awkward pause at the end of the line, and they're going to say, okay. I'll get to that here in just a moment. But all I'm doing is investing sometimes as little as 30 seconds at a time, 5 times a week, 5 different students, to invest and let the parents know what I value in their kid. For those of you who in the room who have children, you know nothing will melt your heart faster than someone saying something nice about your child. So, and this is what good principals do, and then I'll get to your other questions, because this is an interesting topic. As a principal, I've done this before. I got before my staff and said, this is so important, I'm going to cut our staff meeting and half the rest of the time is on you. Just go make your calls. But as a principal, I also required that they tell me who they were calling. So there was some accountability in it as well. So I'm going to do it during my planning time. If I don't ever have any of my own personal planning time, that's a structural issue you have to talk to your leadership about. If you want to know more how to talk about that, we can talk at break. So let me give you a couple of little variations that might help, especially if you have colleagues that aren't quite convinced that this matters quite so much. Imagine just how different the world is today than it was when little Bryan was 10, okay? Here's what would have happened. Now, I was raised with a single mother who had to be kind of tough because my sister and I were challenging at times, and she got no help from my dad because they were split up. But when I was 10, if I did something wrong, here was the conversation between the teacher who called and my mom. Thank you very much for calling. I will deal with it. Thank you. Bryan, come here. Why did you do that? That was the conversation. Today, that conversation sounds like this. Now, I'm generalizing, I get it. I don't think all families are like this, but a lot of families are like this. The parent says, well, thank you very much for letting me know. I will look into it and I will get back with you. See the difference? Yeah. My mom never second guessed that the teacher was telling the truth. Now, I don't think all parents are doing that, but if they don't have the relationship, it's going to be different. So today, I will look into it and I will get back with you. Bryan, come here. Your teacher just called and she said, did you really do that? No, Mom, I never would do that. No, she doesn't. She's always picking on me. It's Bobby. He's always the one. He's bullying me. Then the mom calls back and says, not my son. Right? Like I have better things to do than lie about their kid. It's just we have a different world. Now, the reason I share that with you is because if I preload a lot of the money, and essentially what I'm doing is putting money in the bank. That's what I'm doing. Putting money in the relational bank. When I'm making those positive phone calls home consistently, especially at the beginning of the year, and I've established that connection, then when Mom picks up the phone, she says, really? And then she trusts me because she knows I already like her kid. I already have a bond with her kid. She's going to come over and say, your teacher is called. I know her. I talk to her all the time. Tell me what really happened. So that's a different conversation that's going to happen. When we say good things about the child to the parent, it feeds this relationship. I'll be with you in just a moment. It feeds this internal relationship. You know it strengthens the relationship between the parent and the child, between me and the parent, between the child and me. It just strengthens everything. Because then when I'm going to ask the child to do something difficult or change their thinking or take a risk or do something that they're not wanting to do, we've already established this foundation. I said boundary. A foundation that really makes it worthwhile. Right? So I leave a message, and I say the time to call me is, and I tell them my time that they can catch me at work. So my break is between 12 and 12:40. That's when I'm available to talk more. The purpose of these calls is really not a dialogue. The purpose is me front-loading and feeding into that relationship. Now, if they want to dialogue and I have the time, by all means. But the purpose isn't for me to say, oh, by the way, and remember, he's got 3 projects that are past due, and we have the fair on this weekend. That's not the purpose. The purpose is for me to say how much I like this child, how much I appreciate her, how well she's doing in the class. And then if they say, well, now I got you on the phone, how's she doing, how are her grades, then I'll engage if I have the time. But the purpose is first and foremost to kind of feed into the relationship. Let's talk about these. The question we're attempting to tackle over the next couple of minutes is we've only got a limited amount of time to plan in the first place. Where does it make sense that we plan or spend a significant amount, not all of our planning, but a significant amount? Now, formative assessment is important because you have to have data in order to figure out where to go next. The focus of our session won't be on formative assessment. If you want to know more about formative assessment, see me afterwards. We will talk about feedback. We will not talk about differentiated instruction or anything 5, 6, or 7. We're going to focus on teacher clarity because teacher clarity then basically allows you to do everything else, right? Because if I'm not extremely clear on what it is I want, need, and expect from my students, they're going to be like, I don't get it either. You've probably had a teacher or two in your life where they gave instructions and you looked at your peers and said, huh? What exactly are we supposed to do? I had a college professor, we named him Dr. Vague, because he was not clear on anything. So you just kind of guessed and did something. Luckily, he wasn't a very proficient grader either, so got a good grade, but it's just, he would say, okay, go do it. It's like, do what? So, and you just remember the frustration of having a teacher who, you want to meet expectations, you want to do well, you want to get an A on the assignment, but what am I looking for? There's a lot of different ways we can tackle teacher clarity. I'm going to show you 2 ways for us to get started. So if you want to know more about effect size, this is what John Hattie says about effect size and why we tend to look at it. And then I'll comment on one other thing and then we'll jump in. He points out that nearly everything in education has a positive effect size. There are very few things that have a negative. There are a few things out there that have a negative 0.0 something effect size. Retention is a great example. It's got like a negative 0.2 effect size. In other words, kids do worse the second time around when you retain them in school. Actually, being bored in school, one of my areas of interest, has a -0.37 effect size. But the reason the red line is there is 0.4 is that which most statisticians agree gets you about a year's worth of growth. In other words, if you're doing something with the 0.25, is it still positive? Yes, but it's certainly not going to accelerate your kids. At best, it'll keep status quo. So effect size, he says nearly everything works, but we want to really ask the question, how well does it work? Effect size research helps us answer that question. Most teachers know that if I'm unclear, that's going to get bad results. And so what we do is we lean on things like creation of rubrics. Rubrics are a tool to help provide clarity. So if rubrics showed up somewhere in your discussion, you're right along the path that we're looking at. Teacher clarity is enhanced when I give extremely clear directions on how to complete tasks. So if you talked about directions and clarity of directions, you're right along the way. We're going to talk about 2 more of those. There's a lot of different ways I can enhance clarity, but let me frame it this way. First bullet, teacher clarity is both a mindset and a method, or a method and a mindset. If you're a note taker, method and mindset. Meaning it's something I do, and I'm going to show you some of my favorite ways to do it, just 2 of them because we're limited in time. But it's also a belief that my job is to be as clear as possible. And because when I'm not clear, my kids struggle. That's just normal. That's for all of us. My adult kids will struggle. My little kids will struggle. My job is to sit down and give tremendous amount of time thinking about what exactly do I need from my kids. And I make it as concrete as possible. If you use the word concrete in your discussions, you're right along the way. It's my job to be as concrete and as clear as possible so that my students don't go, huh? Because we've all been in that weird situation where we go, huh? I don't get it. Because if we allow enough opportunities for our kids to go, huh, I don't get it, eventually they'll internalize and say, well, I guess it's me. I don't get it, so I guess I'm just not smart. Whether they call themselves dumb or stupid or something else, they internalize this because there's been so many directions that I don't get. Not too many students are going to raise their hand and say, teacher, you're not being clear, that's why I don't understand. Although they might think it, they probably won't say it. So it's both a mindset or a method and a mindset. It's teaching that's organized and intentional. Yeah, let me elaborate. It's expertly said. Let me take a slight detour because that's such an important point. I didn't add this onto the list because with teacher clarity, there's probably a dozen things we could talk about. Directions is one thing I just chose to take off the list, but since it's an important topic, let's briefly talk about it. The reason it's sometimes a challenge is because in here in my brain, I'm pretty clear on what I need you to do. But my brain and my mouth don't always communicate well together. So when I'm actually giving the directions, although it's clear up here, it's not always clear in my words. I have to constantly struggle with that. Even being a professional communicator as a teacher, I still struggle with that as well. That's why I try to read body language of my students and listen to questions. Because especially with multiple part questions, and that's what you hinted at, sometimes, and I've found myself guilty of this too, I'll say something like this. Students, okay, it's time to work on our book project. Now remember, get your supplies over there. Don't forget to add the rubric to the passive. You've only got about the next 20 minutes. You need to share materials. Don't forget to share materials. And this is going to be sent home. Remember, it's going to be sent home, so you made room in your backpack tonight, right? So I give them like these 18, 19 multiple part directions, and then I say, okay, now go. And then kids are frozen. And I say, come on, go, let's go, 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 go. Like it's them, not me, right? So you hit to the perfect point is I'm better off of saying, students, it's about time to work on our projects. First thing, go get your projects from the shelf. When you have 30 seconds, go and get back. I found this actually, and then I do each part. It slows me down, but it provides that clarity that kids need, those little steps. I found this with my older son, especially when it came time when he was little to clean up his room, like a lot of little boys, is just a nightmare. So if I told Andrew, go clean up your room, I'm going to check on you in a few minutes, I go check on him in a few minutes, he's sitting on the floor playing Legos. And I get frustrated because I said clean your room and he's in there playing. You know, ADD part of it as well going on there. But I found this, if I did this, I said, Andrew, it's time to clean up your room. First thing, go get all your dirty clothes and put them in the laundry room. When you're done with that, come back and see me. And it took me more time, me more effort, but less conflict with Andrew, because then he'd do then I say, next thing, now go take all your books, put them on the bookshelf. When you're done, come back and see me. So in other words, we stepped it. Same thing with directions, because it provided more clarity. It also provided more opportunity to be successful. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that. So back to the second bullet. It's organized and intentional. You can read the second sentence after that. And the third word that goes in there, it's all about transparency or transparent expectations. A lot of the times I'm pretty clear on what I want up here, but I'm not all clear on what I want out there. I'm going to show you two of my favorite ways to go about being a little bit more clear, ones that I practiced even today. Our goal here is to take out the mystery of not only what we're supposed to be doing, but what we're supposed to be learning. It's about taking the mystery out so that kids say, I get it, I see it, I understand what we're supposed to do or what we're supposed to learn, instead of trying to guess along the way. Because a lot of kids, if they're forced to guess along the way, they're just going to reserve and hold back. And then that's not good for them either. Here is the first of the two ways we're going to talk about. You might have heard of this before. In all honesty, I think success criteria has gotten kind of a bad rap a little bit. I'm going to show you maybe a different way to look at it if you've heard of it in less than stellar terms. But what is it? We need to define it first. How do we provide a little bit more clarity? We create what are called success criteria. Leader with your group, is the answer A, B, C, or D? Only one is incorrect. The incorrect answer is A. Right. So we're going to separate just a moment what we might call a lesson goal or an objective and success criteria. Here's a way to think about it. The goal might be the destination. You're going to take a family trip. The destination is the goal. The map is how to get there. The map is the success criteria. The goal might be the target. The success criteria we might call the arrows. The success criteria are the steps in order to help me meet the goal. The success criteria are those very explicit steps I take in order to make sure I know that we're reaching the destination. So by way of analogy, the learning goal is the target. The success criteria are the arrows that help me determine, am I getting to the right place? We're all comfortable, most of us anyway, even new teachers, on creating goals or creating objectives. We'll talk about writing objectives here in a little bit as well. We're comfortable on creating them. We're less comfortable, but just because we haven't practiced it much as a profession, about saying, okay, if that's the goal, what are the specific steps kids need in order to get to that goal? If you've been trained a long, long, long time ago like I was, and you remember a name called Madeline Hunter, Mad Madeline, you remember Madeline Hunter, Essential Elements of Instruction? She called it task analysis. It's the same thing. Today we call it success criteria. Task analysis is saying, if this is what you expect of a child, you have to backwards analyze and say, if they're going to do this, they have to know this, they have to know this, they have to know this. Here's how you get them to that place, in other words. Let me show you examples first, and that might help complete the thought just a little bit. First, I'll just pause so you can soak up the examples that you see there on the screen. We've used the word intentionality and transparency. So success criteria are those written statements, often that go right along with our goals or our objectives, whatever you want to call it, that says, students, this is what we're learning. That's our big target. That's our goal. In order to get there, we're going to do these things. We're going to accomplish these things. In other words, success criteria asks and answers the question, how will you know that you know it? How will I know that you know it? Success criteria are the specific steps in order to help me get there. Let me show you an example maybe that we could even use for this particular workshop. Our goal is to evaluate and plan specific methods for students for deep learning specifically, right? How will you know that you got to that point, or how will I know that you got to that point? Well, can you describe why it works? If you can describe why it works, you're probably much more likely to get to the big goal. One of the nice things about success criteria is it's less worried about whether you put in student-friendly language where I can or you will. There's tons of flexibility. I've seen tons of different models. As long as we're answering the question or helping students answer the question, that's the step I have to take. That's what I have to be able to do in order to meet the teacher's expectation, in this case, the goal. So language is very flexible in this case, is another way to look at it. So I'll know that you know it when we talk about something like feedback, which will be tomorrow. Talk about the concept of feedback. Can you explain in one sentence or less why it's important? If you can do that, you've probably been much more likely to reach the big overarching goal. Can you defend things like academic writing or academic talk and writing and why they work? Those are also topics we'll talk about tomorrow. When you can defend, you're much more likely to be able to do. See, these are the smaller steps to get to the bigger step. If you can rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, a 7+ on your commitment, and you can see the last question on your commit to specific strategies. In other words, if I were to sit down with you, just one-on-one, and say, hey, we spent 2 days together, those are probably the questions I would ask in order to gauge, did you get the big picture? These are the little questions that get to the big picture. That's another way to look at it. We contrast them with goals, and here's how we'll contrast it. We're used to writing objectives and learning goals. There are these big, broad statements. In fact, depending on the organization you work in, there's probably a set of learning standards, right? Standards are big, broad, overarching goals, right? Success criteria forces us to say, if that's the big, overarching goal, how do I get there? What are my specific steps? In other words, imagine this. Kids don't usually do this, but imagine an 8th grader walks into your classroom and says to you, how will I know I'm successful today? They're not asking that, but imagine they did. Most teachers say something like, well, if you do what I tell you to do, stay quiet, do your work. That doesn't really help them because they already know that I'm supposed to do my work, I'm supposed to raise my hand to speak, I'm supposed to make my teacher happy, not supposed to bother other kids. Yeah, I know that. But when it comes to the specific goal you have for me, how will I know that I got it? And if you say, well, you'll know you got it if you get an A on the test, that's not what we're looking at. Let me give you some more examples to wrap our head around this. I'll be honest with you. I don't terribly care whether you call them success criteria or steps to success or whatever you call it. The idea is that we just go through the process of saying, that's what I want from my kids. Here's how we're going to get it. And it's not just for me to make sure I have something on a checklist. It's for kids to be able to reference and then reflect on their own. It's not just me. It's about pulling them into the whole reflection process so that we're in it together. Let me give you a few more examples. I like the way this one is framed. You'll know when you have succeeded. You'll know when you meet that expectation. Think language, I mentioned earlier, we have some flexibility there where you call success criteria something else. It's just about the process of saying, I need to be extremely clear with my kids, not only about what we're doing, because many kids, especially when they get older, into high school, they learn that school's just doing what the teacher tells you to do. Do your projects, do your assignments, pass your tests. Yeah, I don't know that we'll ever totally get away with that, but it's by saying, here's our project, here's why I want you to do that project, and here's how you'll know you're successful at completing the project so that we learn the big thing. Let me give you a couple more examples, then as a table group, we'll dig into any specifics. On the left, you see some example. On the right, I just put them in the form of questions. You can do success criteria in the form of questions. Once again, learning goals are good. They go together. We can't really do success criteria until we know where we're going. It's just about that process of being super, super clear. And this is what Shirley Clark says about it. She's an expert on formative assessment. This falls under the world of formative assessment. This is what she says. And if you're wondering why summarizes is spelled wrong, that's because she's British and that's the way they spell it in Britain. This is also what she says regarding success criteria. And that's a whole nother like an hour-long discussion if we ever wanted to get into it. It's really good. How many of your kids come in and say, what are we doing today? Okay. It's not a bad question. Most kids, it's an honest question because they want to know, well, are you going to use my time wisely? Although they're not saying it that way. They're saying, you're going to bore me to death. That's what they're thinking. But wouldn't it be wonderful if they started coming and say, what do we get to learn today? Because too often we focus on just the tasks you have to complete. Just do this project, complete this worksheet, pass this test. It's part of school, I get it. But if we can start thinking them in terms of success, steps, then they start to ask the question, what do we get to learn rather than just what's the stuff we have to do? Now, the reason we do these, among others, is that it just is empowering. It's empowering so that students can then start to take control of their own thinking, their own learning, their own reflection, and then go a little bit deeper. Can't expect kids to go deep unless they know where and how they're supposed to go deep in their thinking or in their processing. And there's some other steps to it as well. So I mentioned that it's about what we're doing to what we get to learn, and more importantly, how will I know I've learned it? Too many, often, I get stuck into this a little bit mindset in middle school. Too often the focus was, well, you'll know you're successful when you look at the grade book. I had a lot of kids who could get straight A's in everything and not put a lick of work in. And I had other kids who worked pretty darn hard, and C's were about the best they were going to do because of all the other stuff. So it's less about what I have to do to get the grade and more what do I get to learn, because that's exciting. If kids start coming into our classroom saying, well, what do I get to learn and how am I going to be successful at it, that's an exciting discussion. So success criteria in a nutshell is the process of helping kids ask and answer the question, how will you know? I'll know I'm successful when not only do I do the task the teacher tells me to do, because a lot of times teachers say, well, you'll be successful if you do the worksheet I gave you. Okay. I'm not necessarily saying worksheets are a bad thing, but it's about what I'm learning along the way as well as what I'm doing. Learning and doing both go, in that sense, go hand in hand. If this is new to you, if you've not done through this practice before, a couple of suggestions on how to get started. One is start small. Just write maybe 2 or 3 success criteria. Just ask yourself, okay, this is what I want my kids to be able to accomplish. How are we going to get there? It's probably in your mind already, especially if you have tons of experience. Just ask yourself, what are the steps, and can I clearly express those steps to my kids? Sometimes the step is personal reflection. Sometimes it's the completion of a task. Sometimes it's in the answering of a question. But what are those little steps? And maybe just start with a couple of them. This is what I started to do later on in my teaching career, which I still do with my college students, is I say, here's the goal of today's discussion or today's class. Here's what we're going to do, the task we're going to follow, the readings, the discussion questions or the discussion posts, the partner activities, any writing I want them to do. Here are kind of the tasks. And then I added another column, here's why I want you to do it. Part of success criteria is the why. I want you to do this silent quick write because it'll force you to do this over here. And it's always pointing back to the big goal. It's just about being very clear on those little steps. If you have multiple preps, actually even if you don't have multiple preps, consider doing success criteria with the topics you know your kids will struggle with the most. So if I'm a 4th grade teacher and I'm trying to teach a difficult math concept, say division of fractions, which still scares me after all these years, right? I might say, okay, I know my kids are going to grapple and struggle with this. This is hard stuff. Then I'm going to say, I'm going to do my best to be extremely clear and write some success criteria or steps for that. I might say, you know what? Some concepts, they're going to get piece of cake. Most of my kids will do pretty well on this just in my normal instruction. On those things that my kids might struggle with, I say, that's what I'm going to do my success criteria on. We're talking about teacher clarity. Lots of different ways you can improve clarity. Super clear step-by-step directions, that helps. Anchor papers, rubrics, models, all of those things help. There's other ways. We did the semi-deep dive on success criteria just to force us to think, if that's what I want, how do I get there? What are the steps? What's the process? How exactly are we going to get to that destination? That's what success criteria forces us to. Now let's take what might seem like a little step backwards and talk about objectives. Something we have to write goals, we have to write objectives, we have to write targets. Every school calls them something different. I'm going to say a goal, an objective, and a target. We're going to just use those as synonyms at this point. We know this. If it's vague, it's not going to be clear to kids. Vague objectives equal vague learning. And most importantly on this slide, objectives must be measurable. Hereforth, going forward, we never, ever, ever use understand when we write objectives. If you've never thought about this before, here's why. I cannot measure understanding. Sometimes we write objectives and we say, students will understand the causes of the American Revolution. That's fine, but I can't understand, or I can't measure understanding in your brain. Objectives, really clear objectives, are always measurable. So sometimes we write objectives like, students will understand how to add double-digit numbers. Okay? The goal of understanding double-digit numbers is good, but I can't measure whether or not you understand anything. I can only measure what you do or what you say or what you share. Going forward, we're only using words that are measurable when it comes to writing objectives. We can talk about things that are measurable versus not measurable. Let's take a classroom rule, for example. It's only a rule in your classroom if it's measurable. We don't say our rule is to be nice, because I don't know what the heck it needs to be nice. It's very difficult to measure niceness. You never say, students, in our classroom, the rule is to be responsible. Why? Because responsible is a vague term that could mean many, many different things. I don't know what exactly it means to be responsible. It's very difficult to measure responsibility. So when you write classroom rules, you make sure they've always got to be something I can observe and measure. If it's not observable and measurable, it's not ultimately enforceable. When it comes to something like a classroom rule, you would never call a parent of a kid who's had a bad day and say, well, I'm calling home today because he wasn't nice. And the mom would say, okay, well, that's not good. What did he do? Well, he just wasn't playing nice. So, well, okay, give me a specific. So, well, he just wasn't, nice to. That mom's going to look at you like, call me when you got something significant to say. Because what does it mean to be nice? It's just very vague. If we're vague, then our students will struggle. So we know that when it comes to classroom rules, it has to be measurable and observable, because if it's not, I can't enforce it. Same thing with objectives that we write. So you can still say things like be nice, be responsible, use positive language. Just call them expectations, just don't call them rules. So for example, a police officer is never going to pull you over and say, I pulled you over because you weren't driving nicely, right? If a police officer pulls you over and say you weren't driving safely, they might say that. You say, well, what did I do that wasn't safe? And if they say, well, you just weren't driving safely, you're going to say, you got to show me specific. Same goes with writing objectives. So if you're used to using words that might be a little bit vague and you don't want to go through and have to rewrite every objective from the past 10 years, keep those words, just add this one little phrase to it, and that is add the condition, use the word by. So if you want to keep, students will understand the importance of, keep it, and then just set by, because the by is the clarity. The by is what exactly they're going to do in order to express that they understand or that they appreciate or that they value or whatever the vague term is. And when you start sharing that with students, then they're okay, by is the how I'm going to do this. And when we do that pretty consistently, it's a massive, massive benefit for kids. And as you can probably guess, there's some benefits to kids as well. But being clear in success criteria and super clear objectives, or using measurable terms in our writing of objectives, even if we add the word by after there, it adds quite a bit of clarity for kids, and that's ultimately our goal anyway. Because this is ultimately our goal, for kids to go from like, what, to got it. Because when they get to that, where, okay, I got it, I understand it, even if I don't value and appreciate it as much as the teacher wants me to, at least I have a clear vision. Lack of clarity equals frustration. And if we want our kids to think deeply about things and deeply engage in something that's going to require them to think and process and ultimately make a change in their life and somehow, we have to be super clear on how we get them to that point. There's a concept in psychology/sociology called the curse of knowledge. If you've not heard of this, it's a really interesting one called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is simply this. As experts, and you all are experts, you're experts in your content knowledge, you're experts in teaching, you're experts in learning, but let's just take your content knowledge. When we become an expert in something, we're cursed, meaning it's really hard to remember what it's like to not be an expert in that thing. So if you're a fifth grade teacher, you've taught fifth grade math for years, you know fifth grade math, it's easy to you dream about it, you solve it. Fifth grade math is a piece of cake for you. It's second nature, it's the language you speak. Because you have such a depth of knowledge in that content and in those methods and those strategies, it's very easy to forget what it's like to not know what you know. If you think about it, whatever it is, there's something in the world beyond education that you're an expert in. Whether it's photography as a hobby or family history or something you do that you're an expert in. In other words, people look to you as like, you know a lot about that. It's really easy to forget that the people you work with, they don't have the same base of knowledge. Here's a perfect example. Have you ever worked with an IT tech or an IT person who comes to help you with something on your computer and they look at you like you're an idiot? Like, what do you don't know the difference between RAM and ROM? Come on, what's wrong with you? Like, I don't either, right? They're things. So the person who knows computers so well, they're cursed, and the really good ones say, I have to remember I'm dealing with people not who are dumber than me, not who are not as smart as me, but don't have the same experiences as me. And when we realize that because I know something so well, it's easy to forget that you all don't share the same background or the same depth. That's why I step back and say I have to be extremely clear. Success criteria is a way to go about it, rubrics, anchor papers, some of those other things, models we've talked about, writing super clear objectives. That's why, because I need to keep myself in check, because I know too much. Sounds arrogant when you say that, but the truth is, your content, you know too much. In fact, you might know so much that you're not good for your kids because they're looking at you like you're speaking a different language. Clarity forces us to speak the same language as our kids. Since we're talking about how do we get kids to think deeply and engage deeply in something, we're going to finish our discussion today by talking about the power of relevance. If you've not thought about the power of relevance or the importance of relevance in a while, it's a really good discussion. As far as our agenda, here's where we've been. We're making really good progress. So our part of our framework is everything's built on the foundation of relationships. We know that. We're sold on that. We have to put time into planning and clarity. The more time we put into being clear and enhancing our clarity, the better. The second element that we'll talk about now is this idea of relevance. But to start that, regarding this, I'm curious if this has ever happened to you. Real life example of the difference between being on task and engaged. Let's not even use a school example for a moment. Have you ever found yourself on task driving your car but not engaged in driving your car? Is that scary? You realize I've been going like 80 miles an hour down the freeway for the last 10 minutes and I don't know where I was. That's scary. It's entirely possible to be fully on task doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but not mentally engaged. We have to briefly think about the differences before we ask our students to be engaged in something. We have to kind of be a little bit clear on what that means. We'll continue to dig into that here in just a moment. But most of your students, especially by the time they get older, and I'd say older is maybe 3rd grade on up, they know the game of school. You show up every day. You do what the teacher tells you to do. You don't hit anybody. You walk when you're supposed to walk. You turn in your assignments. You do your seat time. You pass your tests, and they pass you to the next grade. And you do that 12 or 13 years in a row, and they say, congratulations, you now have a diploma. They know the game of school. And some of your high school kids are really adept at playing the game of school. And if kids view school as just stuff I have to do so I can get my world to start or my life to start afterwards, this is why, by the way, this is more of a deep philosophical discussion, but it's a really good one. That's why kids cheat. Because if they're not truly engaged and bought into the learning, and I just have to do this thing so that the teacher grades my project or grades my assignment or grades my essay so that I get the grade I want so I can maintain the GPA so I can get my college scholarship or whatever they want to do, just so I can be done. It's easy, if you think about it, really easy to justify cheating. Because it's not the learning, it's the grade that I'm after. So the more we're clear about how we engage kids into deep learning, and we can set those things aside, especially at the high school. Are we ever going to set aside grades and GPAs and achievement tests? Probably not. Well, when I'm emperor, someday we will, but that'll be a while. We're probably not going to set it aside, but if we could at least for the moment say to our kids, for now, let's not worry about the achievement part, let's focus on the learning. When we get to learn, what we get to experience, that's really cool. And by the way, we'll talk about all that formal stuff later. It's a big ask, but it's possible, I know. So let's dig in, continue this discussion for just a moment. Oh, by the way, one last moment thought about that. One way you can reflect on being the difference between on task and engaged is just ask yourself the question, how do you know when you're engaged in something? I know Bryan knows I'm truly engaged and bought in when I don't look at this thing. When I'm not constantly looking at my watch for the next thing I get to do. When I'm not constantly thinking, okay, can I go run to the bathroom right now? I lose track of time. When I'm fully engaged in something, I don't even worry about it. I'm like, wow, it's going by fast. When I can laugh, I know I'm probably engaged in something when I can have fun and collaborate and laugh. So what we often do is we ask ourselves, what are the characteristics for you when you know you're really into it? It's probably that way for your students as well. When you can collaborate, when you can physically move, when you can laugh, when you can talk, when you can dig into something interesting, which gets us to this point right here, and that is the focus on relevance. In order to think deeply about something, we have to give our kids something interesting to think about, and it all comes down to relevance. If you've not thought about relevance recently, we'll do that dive right now into it. Relevance is all about answering the question, what's in it for me? In fact, here's your favorite acronym. If you've never heard this one before, it's WIFM, W-I-I-F-M. Have you heard this one before? W-I-I-F-M, what's in it for me? Feel free to steal that. I stole it from someone else. WIFM answers the relevance question. Every single one of your students, from little to big, are coming into your classroom every day asking this question, although it's not conscious. They're not thinking about it, but it's running in the background. All right, what do I get today? It's a very selfish one, but your brain asks the same question. All of our brains ask the same question. In fact, if I didn't do a decent job answering that question for you at 9 o'clock and 9:10 and 9:15 this morning, you would have revolted, and you rightfully should have. Other than you're nice, polite people, and there's other benefits from sticking around till 4 o'clock, I get that. But if I don't do a decent job of my audience of saying, this is why it's important for you, people then tend to check out. Now, as adults, we're all nice and polite, and we'll continue to nod and get our free lunch and play along. But in our minds, we're like totally somewhere else. That's how important relevance is. Relevance drives attention. Relevance drives meaning. All sorts of things I'll share with you. So let's dig into this idea just a little bit more on the power of relevance and why it matters for deep thinking. This model comes to us from our friends at Quantum Teaching. Now, this book by Bobby DePorter and her colleagues is old at this point. I think the book's probably 20 plus years old, but it's one of those classics in my world anyway, where an oldie but goodie. And they describe it this way. Our job as teachers is to understand that our worlds are not always the same. In all reality, this should probably be a Venn diagram because there is some overlap between our world and theirs. But for now, let's just separate the ideas. Our world, I'm going to talk about our teacher world. Our teacher world consists of class lists and schedules and grades and assignments and updating the grade book and going to PD meetings. And that's our world. You understand your world so well. I could plop you out of North Carolina and put you in any school in the United States, in any state, in any community, and you would know exactly how it runs. You could go from a wealthy suburban school where all the parents have lots of money, and I could put you in the poorest inner city school, and you would feel at home because you know how it works. You know the structure, you know the environment, you just know school. That's our world. Now, there are other aspects of our world, but our world, we're only talking about the school world here for just a moment. When it comes to school, their world is different. Their world, by talking about students, consists of my friends. Most kids go to school not to learn, but to hang out with their friends. Now, the good news, I don't know all kids, of course, but kids, I generally believe, want to learn. They want to do well, they want to learn, they want to achieve. But what's driving them are two things. Compulsion, by law, they have to go, or they get in trouble, or somebody gets in trouble. And that's where my friends are. If I didn't have to go there and my friends were someone else, would I show up at school? Some kids maybe, because they generally want to learn. But a lot of kids like, well, I'm going to go hang out with my friends over there. Their world, when it comes to school, consists of my friends are there. I got to go because that's where my friends are. That's where football practice is. That's where the club is that I like. That's where I'm learning how to play the guitar. I mean, there's other things. I don't want to make it sound like kids never care about academics, but that's not, for most of them, their primary driver like it is for you. Academics and achievement for your kids is what you drive, which is why you tolerate bad professional development meetings and sitting through those principal meetings and having to do your lesson plans, because you know it's ultimately going to drive towards learning for your kids. I mentioned earlier there's some overlap, so there should probably be a Venn diagram and then separate, but visually this helps a little bit. This is what Bobby DePorter and her colleagues say. It's our job as educators to go into their world first and then bring them back into our world. Far too many teachers, traditional ones, Traditional teaching isn't always bad, but far too many teachers say there's a one-way arrow from their world to ours. Your job is to come into my world and do what I tell you to do. I was kind of like that early on in my secondary teaching career because that was all my model. My mentor teacher when I student taught was about the most authoritarian person I'd ever seen. And her mentality was, my classroom, do what I tell you to do. Follow the rules, we'll be fine. Don't follow the rules and you're going to be miserable. And she let it known that kids would be miserable. So that was kind of my model, although I didn't have the same attitude as she did. My mentality was, I'm the king of this environment. Keep the king happy. I don't think that's the right approach, because this should be a little bit more of a team approach. See, a traditional approach says, it's your job, student, to come into my world and do what I tell you to do, because when you do what I tell you to do, you'll get decent grades and you'll get promoted, then you'll go on in life. I think that's setting up a pretty bad example for our kids. So a better way to look at it is, our job is to first go into their world and figure out what is in their world that I can then connect to school. What is it they care about in their own world? And then I can say, there's a connection between something you care about over there and something we're learning over here. And this is actually the skill of veteran teachers. Veteran teachers, ones who know their content really well, and they know their kids really well, and they're constantly building the bridge. If the bridge for our kids is, learn it because it's going to be on the test, a lot of kids don't care about the test. But if the bridge is learn it because it's relevant to some aspect of your life that you care about, then kids tend to buy in just a little bit. So relevance is simply this. When my brain says, that's for me, that's relevance. When somebody else's brain says, this is for you, that may or may not be relevant, but I have to buy into it. When my brain says, oh, that's for me, what drives, when relevance is kicked into my brain and my brain says, I want that, that's for me, that's connecting to my own personal life in some way, then what drives that is my attention, my motivation, my task persistence. Because it's instead of the teacher saying, you need to know this to pass the test, or you need to know this for next year, or you need to know this in order to graduate, which, by the way, are all true statements. But it's when the kid's brain says, I need to know this so, and they connect it to their own life, then it's relevant. Relevance is this idea that it's worth knowing for me. As a teacher, I was a middle school social studies teacher first. My approach to relevance was, well, you got to know this. It's in our curriculum. You got to know this. You got to test on this. But more I started to make the shift of saying there's something in history that we can learn that you can apply in your own life. Let me give you an example. I remember very, very clearly there was a small unit, but a unit nonetheless, on the War of 1812. If you're not a history teacher in the room, you probably can't tell me more than 5 things about the War of 1812. And you can't count that it was in 1812. So I looked at this. Okay, can't count that either. So I remember looking at this thinking, why would an average 7th grader need to know about it was sometimes called the Second American Revolution. Britain was not happy with us for the first one. They came back, tried again, we whipped them again, and so on. Anyway, that's all you need to know about the War of 1812. There's some other things, of course. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's what I tried to do. I tried to think, is there something that they can relate to their own personal life? And here's what I did. I focused that unit on conflict. And I said, students, we're going to learn about conflict resolution. We're going to learn about what are good ways to resolve conflicts, what are not so good ways to resolve conflict, what are going to get you in more trouble when you do it, what are going to get you out of trouble when you do it. By the way, we're going to use an historical example to learn about conflict. And the War of 1812 was perfect because it had to do with past grudges and history that wasn't let go and people who wanted to get revenge. So good. When you look at it from that perspective, then they say, well, let's look at how they handled it then and see if there's anything we can learn in our own personal life. Because conflict resolution is relevant. Most of them will see that. We're just using an historical example as a case study. When we view it as relevant, you use the last phrase was perfect. Then I tend to go all in. I then tend, when I see it as relevant, then I tend to see, okay, I get why we're doing this, and I'm going to keep going rather than I just got to do this. I get to do this versus I got to do this. When it's relevant, when my brain clicks in and says, oh, that's for me, I want that, then I get to do something rather than I have to do a whole bunch of stuff that the teacher's telling me. So it's personal, right? It's worth personal knowing. It's interesting to me. Let me give you a little bit of the background and research. You probably don't need a ton of it to be convinced that relevance matters. I'll give you just a little bit. This is coming from the world of career and technical education, but they asked the question in this study, how do you motivate and engage your students? You see the relationships, the theme there as well. But then they also pointed out you have to make the curriculum interesting and relevant. Now, this is hard actually in some ways, because not everything can be interesting in your curriculum. I know that. Let's be honest, some of the stuff you got to teach your kids is boring. So can I make everything 100% relevant to kids? Probably not, but that's ultimately my goal, because that's what skilled teachers do. They say, I've got my kids over here and I got my curriculum over there. What's the bridge? The bridge is relevance. And when I can make a decent relevance bridge, then they tend to cross that bridge. If I don't make, or if the only bridge I'm trying to make is you got to do this for your grade, kids who don't care about their grades say, well, why should I bother? We could turn these into questions. We could ask the question, how do I get my students to pay attention to something? Make it relevant. How do I get my students to be motivated and to sustain effort? Make it relevant. How do I get my kids to drive meaning or derive meaning from the content? Make it relevant. That's how important this is. The brain is a bit of a relevance machine. I mentioned earlier it's a prediction machine. It's also a relevance machine, meaning when my brain clicks in and says, that's for me, I want it. The truth is, I don't want to say this so it's misunderstood, because I don't want us to think that we shouldn't be excellent teachers, but the truth is, if I can help establish relevance, I don't have to be a great teacher. Right. Because the students then, they grab on and they become their own teachers. Now, I want to be an excellent teacher. I always want to improve my craft. I always want to be a better communicator. But if I can establish relevance as my base, then they're all in and they're tackling topics and they're having the discussions and they're digging just a little bit deeper and they're taking risks and they're going, right? I don't want to make it sound like I'm lazy. I just establish relevance and I sit at my desk all day. That's not what we do, because I still have to manage the flow of learning, because kids will get off track, of course. But I might ask it this way as well. If I look out at my students and say, man, they are not focused and motivated, I might say, did I not connect it? Is it not relevant enough for them? And that's, again, where skilled teachers step back and say, I know all this about my kids and I know all this about my content. Where's the bridge? And in fact, we're going to dig into that in like grade level groups here in just a few moments as well. If I want them to transfer learning, if I want them to buy in, the more relevant it is, the better it is. That's how important this is. A little bit more background, then we'll put you in like level groups, grade level groups, and then we're actually going to do a little bit of an experiment with this. Now, this particular study comes from college students. Even though it's with college students, I think it's still relevant for those of us who work with younger students. They asked college students, how can we establish relevance? And they said, well, make it useful and make it related. Let me see the utility of it, how it's actually used in the real world, and relate it to me personally into what I want to do. Again, we can't do that for everything for every single one of our topics, but the more I can do, the better. How do I relate to this thing? How does this reflect me or my community or my personal background? How can I personally relate to it, and how can I use it in the future? You may have heard of this as well, relationships and relevance before rigor. You've heard rigor, right? We've abused that word just a little bit too much in our profession. But we know relationships come first, that's our foundation. Then when I add relevant content, ideas, and activities to the relationship foundation, then kids are ready to do rigorous work. We just define rigorous work as deep and meaningful work. Rigor doesn't mean hard. Rigor doesn't mean you give them tons and tons of work. But they're ready to do rigor when they see it's relevant. Why would I be rigorous and dig deep and try difficult things and do the sweating of learning if it's not relevant for me in the first place? If I'm only doing it because the teacher wants me to do it, if I'm only doing it for a grade, then I'm going to do the minimum I need in order to get the grade I want, even when I really care about learning. So we know we have solid relationships, then relevant tasks, then challenging deep work. This study, also from college students, just asked the same question. How can we establish relevance? They said these 4 things. I'll let you take a look. So the question then is, how might we do that? How might we make it relevant? Again, in like grade level groups, we'll dig into this here in just a moment. But I think, what do I know about my kids? First, I have to choose a topic that I think it would be interesting to them. If it's not interesting to those third graders or those fifth graders or those high schoolers that I'm teaching, then I'm probably going to miss the mark. The good thing about those of you who teach little kids, pre-K on up through maybe second grade or so, third grade's a little off sometimes in whether they're big kids or little kids, but little kids tend to be interested in, just want to engage in everything. That's just because that's who they are, and that's good. We still want to establish relevance there, but it's a lot easier to pull along your average second grader than it might be your average 10th grader. So what you do is you choose an interesting topic that goes into your planning time. When you're planning, you're constantly thinking, what's interesting? Where's the bridge between the content and them? What's that bridge? I give a lot of thought to that. Then I present the topic in a number of ways. It could be a scenario, a fascinating fact, a question, a statistic, a scenario like a what if. I just get this topic in front of them. I'll show you a couple of examples of those topics here in just a moment. Then I have them interact with that topic, and I'll show you more of those. Most of those come up tomorrow, but lots of interesting strategies. But the focus initially is, what's the topic that's going to be interesting to kids? By the way, you can ask them, what are topics that are interesting to you? I have to be careful with high school kids, of course, but drugs and sex, right? Other than that. You probably don't bring that up, though. Probably don't say it that bluntly, do you? A school-appropriate way to say that, right? Here are some ways I might try to establish relevance with kids. I might say something like, did you know, actually I think this number's off now, only 40% of Americans have $1,000 for an emergency? That means you can't even fix your transmission. You're done, right? So that's just an interesting fact that if I'm working with high school kids and we're talking about money, $1,000 might seem like a lot, but it's not enough to pay your rent, let's be honest. If you lose your paycheck, you're homeless. So that's just a topic that I might get in front of them. I talk a lot about brain stuff, so sometimes I put them in the form of humor, and I say something like this, because I do a lot of brain work, memory stuff. Did you know, has anybody ever told you your brain was designed to forget things? Did you know that? Your brain was actually designed to forget stuff. So if you tend to forget stuff, congratulations, you're normal. I can't call you normal. I don't know you that well. But your brain was actually designed to forget more than it remembers. Pretty interesting. In fact, is anybody like me, they tend to forget names pretty quickly? You're normal. There's a reason for that. And it's not because you're getting dementia, right? There's actually a reason for that. So sometimes I start brain or memory sessions with that topic because most people I met is like, yeah, I tend to struggle to remember stuff I think I should remember. But when you know that your brain is actually designed to forget most of what you learn, why? Because most of what you learn isn't relevant. Not for the long term, not for your long term anyway. Let's see, what's other interesting? The rest of them are. Oh, here's one I didn't put on the list. I don't know why I didn't put it on the list. But I've done this with high school kids before. I've said something like, so I just recently read a survey. The number one question teens ask about dating is this. Do you want to know what it is? They'll look like, yeah, right? So when I put something out there, dating is relevant to teens, and then I throw out there like a statistic, the number one thing teens want to know, and then that pulls them in, and once I've grabbed them with something that's relevant, then we're off to the races. Then it gets a lot of fun.